to the next challenge called swap values. I would like to be able to pass an array with two elements to my swap values function, pictured over here, to swap the values. However, it appears the values aren't changing. Can you figure out what's wrong here? So this is a case where we're going to fix an existing piece of code. You know, you're going to encounter a lot of situations like that. So what do we have here? Let's check this class out quick. I'll expand. It's called Swapper. So what do we have here? We have a public, remember these are properties. We talked a little bit about property with these built-in getters and setters. And it's a simple object array called arguments. And one thing to note, maybe we'll expand upon properties a little bit each time they come up. Do you notice anything different about this one? We have this private access modifier now with the setter. So what this means is that outside users, code outside of the swapper class can't modify the value of this arguments. Notice how get, there's no private on it, so they can use the getter to find out what the arguments are, but they can't modify it. So that's a nice feature where you get to control your own data, which is what you want. And then what does this mean? Swapper, right? Access modifier, class name, so we know this is a constructor, right? There's no return type. It's going to take an object array of args, it's the same thing as arguments, and it simply assigns it. So when you create a swapper class, you have to provide an object array containing args. I thought the example was a little unclear. They kind of imply that it's just two values you're dealing with. Yeah, pass an array with two elements, but they don't really enforce it. So if it needed to be exactly two arguments, I would check that here. I would say if args.length is greater than 2 or not equal to 2, handle it. Throw an error, throw an exception, do whatever you got to do to handle that situation. So I would say that's one mistake with this. It's not what they're looking for to fix it. And just to prove that it's wrong, let's go ahead and run the test so we can see that it'll fail. So yeah, indeed, this is broken. I'd failed in swapping 1 and 2. You can see the test they have below. They used a couple of integers, 1 and 2. And then they expected it to be swapped around. Notice they're saying the first argument 0, should be 2. It was 1 up here. And arguments 1, which was 2 up here, they're making sure that it's 1. So that's what it should be if they do in fact get swapped, but they're not here. So anyways, back to the code, I would say enforce that. Heck, why not? If args.length is not equal to 2, throw new, what did we use in the last one? Argument exception. We'll try that, and I think I have to bring in using system for that, for the exceptions. Okay, so let's make sure we have 2. And then, so what's the problem? This is okay, right? It's just taking a collection, assuming it's size 2, which we enforced, and it simply loads this arguments up, it gives it a value. So that seems pretty reasonable. But what's going on in this swap values method? So what we're doing is, and this is a good time to talk about scope. We've briefly touched on it, but when you define a method like this, right, we talked about the curly braces defining the scope for that method. Meaning this, you could think of the lines between the braces as sort of their own little environment. And so when you make variables in these functions like this, compare that to if I made a variable out here, right? If I said public int field, this is going to persist, right? This is part of the class. So this doesn't go away once a method runs. Even if I invoke it in here, if I say field plus equals 1, I just added 1 to it. I could have used plus, but you get the point. When I can use field in here, and when this function completes and terminates, field doesn't go away, but args will. Notice that it's defined here. It's got the type and the variable name. This isn't a member variable, right? If it were a member variable, we could just access it by name like we did here. Or like is being done here, right? Arguments is a member. See, arguments. So, yeah, it's important to note the difference in that. This is part of the class. It persists. If I make up variables inside my method, they're just temporary, that are alive when the method is executing. And once it stops, they're deleted. They go away. And they'll be created all over again once the method runs again. So, we know now that this args is declared here. It's defined within this scope only. So if I had another method too, I mean, consider this. Public void some method. And you might already realize this, but I can't say args length here, right? I couldn't do something like this. You know, it's going to blow up. It's going to say, what do you mean args? What the heck is args? Args isn't a member. It was something made in this other method, in this defined to this scope only. It's not in scope down here, so you can't do that. And you can try running something like that if you want to prove it to yourself, if you don't believe me. So yeah, big deal knowing the scope. Okay. So, with that said, we have args, this kind of temporary object collection that matches like our arguments. It's going to, in fact, load it up with arguments 0 and arguments 1. And I suppose that would have been okay if you didn't want to enforce anything here, you know, and let someone put a length 5 or more, whatever, in here. But just know that it'll only swap the first 2 elements. And if that's okay with you, then don't enforce a size. It's kind of weird to me, but, you know, if that's what you want it to do. Good deal. So yeah, otherwise you could have just said object args equals arguments. But with this, you know, they'll take the first and second elements of arguments. That's fine. And then with this syntax might look a little weird too, with the new and then array symbol, but it didn't specify a type. It's able to infer the type based on the values within these curly braces. So since arguments 0 and arguments 1 are objects, it knows that you're saying it's a new object array, and you don't have to type new object array. In case that looked a little weird. So anyways, we have this collection now where we took our first 2 elements, and we're going to make this temporary variable, right? So we can reassign values without losing data. So they make this object temp, and it's just going to hold arg0. And by doing that, it's going to let us overwrite arg0 in the next line. If we didn't save what arg0 was, we wouldn't know what to assign back to args1 in this line. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's just, you're storing it, then you can reassign and use the original value in the next element. All right, so you might be thinking, okay, that seems like a swap happens, and it does. What's the problem? Well, it's back to that idea of scope. What happens after this last line? You did, in fact, take the original values and swap them, but then what? This args, it just goes away once this value is done. After this line here, all blown away, right? So how do you make that persist? You actually have to assign it. You have to actually swap your arguments around, the field itself, and that will persist. So you could say arguments equals args, swapped around. Again, I'll ignore the thing if you allow more than 2 if you allow more than two sized array here, then you could have problems here. You could go either way with it, so adjust it for your policy. Maybe you wanted to say argument 0 equals arg0, and another line arguments index 1 equals args index 1. If for you, however you need to make your policy hold together. But that's the idea, is that you have to make this change persist. You have to actually modify the arguments themselves, because if we go back to the test, notice it's testing against the values in the arguments collection. And so the way this code was originally given to us, it only modified this temporary args, and the changes never persisted. So when you go tap arguments to get the value, they're what they always were. No swapping took place. So that said, I think that it's really all we should have needed to do. We'll hit that test. Hopefully see some green. Looks good. I'll get rid of this, however you want to go about that, what you allow, what you don't. I think the challenge could have been more clear on that. Okay, let's attempt. Looks good. Okay, yeah, we're ready to submit. We'll see if other people did the same thing, or if they took some liberty to redesign things. I wasn't trying to do that. I was just trying to fix the problem and preserve what I could. So we'll submit, grab our honor points, our 7 Caillou or whatever that was. So yeah, we're submitted. Ooh. Ability to estimate the ranking of your own beta kata. Cool, new privileges. Anyway, what'd they do? Temp. So they just didn't even introduce the temporary variable. Fine. Args, yeah, similar kind of thing. They just used, yeah, same kind of idea. This look good. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, hit me up. Otherwise, we'll move on. Thanks for watching.